Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respective families wherever located on this God's green earth. Welcome to this episode of the Real Talks with Amini. I'm honored to have Mr. James Joseph, Director of Duty Legacy, a prominent figure on the human rights space at the global level. He's based in United Kingdom, a friend of Afghanistan, and we are honored to have him on the show. Welcome, James. Glad to have you. Thank you for the opportunity and your time to speak with us today. Maybe we can start by talking about yourself. How did you get involved in the human rights space and the legal journalism space? What inspired you to do this work? And also, maybe you can briefly talk about the Duty Legacy. What is it? What is its mission in the global human rights space?
First of all, thank you, Sadiq, for the invite. I'm honoured to be on the podcast. So to begin with, so for me personally, it was never something that I set out to do. My first degree was in English literature, so it wasn't in the human rights space. Then I went and did law, and then a master's in public international law, and then the bar training course that typically qualifies you to be a lawyer in the UK, but I've never actually practiced. My first sort of soiree, if you like, into the human rights field started with a few internships with multilateral institutions. I went to work for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Slavery and a few other entities, human rights entities across the world. And this really, for me, showed up the issues. And this was at the time when Afghanistan was just about to fall. So this was in sort of June, July of 2021, prior to the fall of Kabul. And you could see in the news that things were starting to heat up. And then a lot of the work that I was then doing for sort of these organizations was on the impending fall. So this was really my first main sort of conflict, if you like, that I worked on, and it's one that stuck with me and one that has been enduring throughout the last few years, really.
Yeah. Well, we're glad to have you focusing on this area, which is very important for Afghanistan and, of course, for humanity. So maybe we can start by, from your standpoint as an expert in the field, if you can give us an assessment of the human rights situation in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule.
Well, first of all, I will say that my assessment is a very bleak one. There isn't much to say positively on the human rights standpoint at the moment. Women and girls banned from education, banned from work, banned from all forms of public life, a total gender apartheid going on in Afghanistan, a gender apartheid which also extends to other religious minorities such as Shias, Hazaras, Tajiks, and really a total lack of any formal structure for dealing with anything in Afghanistan. Democracy is totally gone. The human rights landscape is totally eroded. Impunity reigns across Afghanistan, and really Afghanistan has been left as a sort of pariah state in the eyes of the world. The rule of law is totally out the window. LGBT rights are out the window. Minorities are persecuted left, right, and centre. There is absolutely no deterrence. There's no stopping any of it, and so we've not gone anywhere apart from backwards over the last few years since the fall, and it doesn't seem like we're going to go anywhere different.
Mm-hmm. And what about the perspective of the people in Western societies on when they're looking at more than 20 years of being engaged in Afghanistan, and basically, from the first time, building the country up, whether it was democracy, human rights, freedom of media, women's rights, and all the achievements that the country had for more than 2 decades as a result of the intervention and involvement of the Western countries in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, all of them, collapsing and nothing there, and the Taliban coming back for the second time. What do you think was the feeling in those societies, particularly as someone who's in the United Kingdom? What do you think the British people thought, and when looking at this at the country and the return of the Taliban for the second time?
Well, I think if you look at the interventionist politics of the West more broadly, we have this dynamic of interventionism. We have this dynamic of go in and take those that are persecuting people to task. But the actual long-term goals were never really laid out with Afghanistan. There was never really a long-term vision of where that was going to go. So after 20 years of Western-led intervention by the US and the UK, and other allies, cynically, there wasn't really any other place this was going to go. And I think from a perspective of external countries, there was a real fatigue around the fact that this war had gone on in most part, or Afghanistan had been part of the lexicon for the entirety of most people's lives. And I think even if you go back before the 20 years of intervention, before that you had Russia's intervention in Afghanistan, before that there's always been intervention in Afghanistan's internal politics by external forces, by other countries wanting to pillage resources from Afghanistan. There's always been Afghanistan as this plunderous state, if you like, and I think that has desensitized so many people to the situation in Afghanistan because of that fact that there is people have always seen it as this country that was to be intervened in. It was always a country that was at war, whether over oil or over resources, natural resources. So I think externally, by the time the war finished, everyone was. By the time forces withdrew after the Taliban sort of took hold again, or the Taliban were encroaching, there was almost a disbelief because it had been under Western forces for so long that they had this superficial stability within the country. Now, I think that then in turn meant that when the country and the Taliban did take over, it took everyone by surprise, and that's the real failure. That nobody saw it coming and nobody acted when it was coming, and so the failure of that sort of Western state building narrative sort of played out before our eyes, as we've seen in conflicts before.
Yeah, and the people of Afghanistan saw it coming because we were observing how all of a sudden our friends are warming up and engaging with the Taliban that was a terrorist group, a terrorist organization, and it still is a terrorist organization, a terrorist group, and of course a clear human rights violator since they've come about. And we knew where it would end. Unfortunately, at the time, our friends were not listening to us. And so they were having this utopian idea that maybe there could be peace agreement with the Taliban, and then other Afghans could join in, and there could be some negotiated settlement that could pave the way for all the human rights and the freedom of the Afghan people to be guaranteed, at the same time allow the Western countries to still stay and be present in Afghanistan, and the Taliban to be incorporated within the system, which it's very difficult to see those contradictions. It's very easy to see the contradictions that probably it was difficult for our colleagues, or maybe they intentionally didn't want to see it. But how do you think that the justification from the Western countries came about to bypass the value system that they adhere to, that they believe in, that the institutions are advocating for, like human rights, women's rights, freedom, democracy, all of these ideals, and then go in and engage with a group that does not believe in any of them, that even publicly claims that if they get the power, they will erode those. They will eliminate these rights, not just the rights of Afghans as they did, but also if they get the power, they would like to impose their Sharia system, the way they're interpreting it, on all of the world, because they believe that they have got the God a message, and they've got the right from direction. They're receiving directions from the God, apparently. And so what sort of justifications were used for that sort of an engagement?
Well, I think it's a really tricky situation to navigate. I think that the West were put in a very tricky situation when it came to withdrawing, and the Taliban, as I said, the takeover was so swift, but also the brutality of the Taliban, like as you said, their interpretation of Sharia law is very hard line. It's very anti-women, it's very anti-Western, it's very anti-norms that we associate with other religions. And I think that this it's not it's not Islam in the sense of the peace-loving religion we all know. It's a very hardline reading, and I think that obviously that totally is totally the opposite of any values that we hold dear in the West. But again, I think that the Western forces didn't have too much of a choice as to whether to withdraw or not. And I think that it just also shows that regionally, I think, how swift that sort of that Sharia reading of Islam was to come over Afghanistan, and how quickly it came in from other territories and other forces that were still lurking. And we see that now so much coming into the West, and we see it all over the world. But I think Afghanistan is sort of the hotbed of that, and I think that without I don't think that Western forces being there was sustainable. But the only option really was something. It was a sort of Western-led governance structure to be imposed on Afghanistan, with the diaspora communities involved. One thing I'll also mention is that, as we both know, Afghanistan is such a diverse tapestry of ethnicities, of religions, of peoples, and I think that really was something that that Talib forces couldn't see as being appropriate, because that sort of reading of Sharia as a blank slate approach to subjection and subversion of cultural norms.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, the Western forces did what they did, and they could have done it in a different way, in a much better way that could have safeguarded the freedoms and values that was there in Afghanistan, and the systems, institutions, but that's done. Post-Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, how do you assess the Western countries' engagement with the Taliban, with Afghanistan issue overall, and also international organizations like the UN and other human rights entities and organizations? How do you assess their efforts of basically trying to keep the Taliban accountable to the human rights values as much as they could, at least publicly through statements and others in the past 3.5 years?
Well, I think it's to that exact point that you have a terrorist organization which has taken over a country that you have absolutely no external leverage with, whether diplomatically, politically, legally, morally. You have absolutely no leverage to do what you want. Obviously, Afghanistan's diplomatic missions have been existing on absolutely no finance whatsoever, trying to externally advocate for a country which doesn't, for a government, if you like, a de facto that doesn't actually want to acknowledge them or want to associate with them. And I think that I think that it's a double-edged sword, really, because although you don't want to do deals with the Taliban, and nobody wants to do deals with the Taliban, I mean, you can see, I'm sure we'll go on to this, but you can see from countries such as China who have gone and done deals with the Taliban and done diplomatic relations, done diplomatic, completed diplomatic ties, etc. Is that that very much is testament to both countries' authoritarian rule. But I think for Western nations, the issue of Taliban, of acknowledgement of the Taliban and recognition of their government, is that it is pretty much the only way to have any leverage over Afghanistan at present. The other slant is that you can obviously withdraw aid, which we've seen. You can withdraw support for various mechanisms that are working within Afghanistan, aid organizations, etc. But again, that only seeks to isolate women and girls, isolate minorities, isolate those that are at risk. So it's a really hard situation. It's a case of sort of recognize the Taliban as legitimate government, and start conversations with them, which in turn is a legitimization of them as a government. But equally, it's the opposite, which is a legitimization of the breaches of rule of law, the breaches of human rights that they seek to engage with over Afghanistan and Afghanistan's people.
Yeah, anyway, that is there, and we are hearing those arguments from people who are engaging the Taliban. As you indicated, there are two sets of countries that we are witnessing at the global stage trying to work with Afghanistan. There's one set of countries in the neighborhood of Afghanistan, like China, like Russia, Iran, Pakistan. These are the countries that are, we can hardly tell that these countries are democracy. There's no democracy there.
Yeah.
There's no freedom. There's no human rights. There's no dignity for their own citizens. These are authoritarian regimes. And these authoritarian regimes have been supporting the Taliban before the collapse, and they have been supporting the Taliban post the collapse. And they have also tried to, as you stated, extended, diplomatic relationships. They have accepted the Taliban representatives and all that. And then we have the Western countries that are tiptoeing between whether they should follow what the authoritarian states are doing as a formula to engage the Taliban, or to go back to their traditional role of being the champions of human rights, the champions of democracy, the champions of freedom, the champions of liberty and dignity of human beings, and stand firm on their ground. And do not coddle, and do not compromise, and do not capitulate to a terrorist organization and the narrative of their sponsors, which are clearly the axis of evil, those neighborhood countries in the neighborhood. How do you see the Western countries leaning? Like, do you think they're leaning more towards being a follower of the authoritarian states in the neighborhood, or you think there are forces within the Western societies that are people with logic, with wisdom, necessary wisdom, and also with an understanding of a long view of what it would look like for the Western societies, and try to steer away the Western countries from further engagement with the Taliban and further capitulation, further facilitation of the Taliban to continue to rule over Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think that the issue with Western engagement with the Taliban is that the failure of the failure of Western-led forces and the failure of the West to engage diplomatically led to this, I think, a sort of shame or guilt of Western countries to then decide what to do next. And I think that's just allowed, like you say, that axis of evil to grow and to thrive. But equally, we see across the world there are so many conflicts going on. As soon as Afghanistan had happened, within months, we had the following February, we had the Ukraine crisis, and really Russia as a force in that region has been tied up with its war in Ukraine. So I think what then we see is Russia that's sort of always had this Soviet hammer over Afghanistan is too tied up in Ukraine. Countries like Iran are always, countries like Iran have always done what they've done. They've always gone against Western principles. They've always been a power, but not a I wouldn't say a problem so much externally. Pakistan obviously are in the Taliban's pockets. We've seen that with them sending people back over the borders, back into Afghanistan, those that fled in the months after the conflict. But I don't. I think that the West is tied up with so much else going on and trying to protect its own territories, its own democracy, and I think that the issue with that is it's allowing this crisis to continue to get worse. But then the flip is that I think the West is saying, how could it get much worse? And so we're at this state now where it couldn't really get much worse. So at some point we will have to tackle it. But I think it's a case of let the Taliban weaken themselves, and they will eventually collapse. And I truly believe that we will see that. But I think that navigating the geographical sphere of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, those neighboring countries is a really tricky one. In terms of where the West goes, and does it want to pick fights with Iran, who obviously is a major nuclear power, or do we want to continue with sort of ignorance, which I think we've gone so far down this track now of that's left the West in a diplomatic limbo, not knowing how to deal with the situation as it gets progressively worse. What I will say to the positive on that is that I think that diaspora communities in the West have had so much leverage and so much ability to continue to push the narrative of what is happening inside Afghanistan, along with organizations that are helping refugee communities, that are helping those that have been displaced, to continue to amplify the voices of women and girls, continue to amplify the voices of minorities, and I think that's where any leverage is going to come from at present. It's going to come from external leverage from displaced communities living in Western countries, to be able to talk to representatives, to be able to leverage governments. But it's, again, it's such a tricky situation.
Yes, and you mentioned about the regional countries and how they're involved in different aspects. There's one narrative that clearly the Taliban were being backed and supported by the Russians as they were financing them to kill Americans, the British soldiers and others, and also the Chinese were involved through Pakistan and Iran. Basically, they didn't want the U.S. forces to be present in their neighborhood, particularly Bagram. They really were worried about the U.S. forces there. The coalition forces there, and of course, Iran publicly has stated that they wanted to make sure that the Western forces leave the region, not just Afghanistan, Iraq, but everywhere. But their primary were looking at removing them from Afghanistan, and Pakistan were also in cahoots with them, because even though they were shaking hands with the Western countries, at the same time they knew that their reality is tied with the country, the neighborhood. And so they were working with the Russians, they were working with the Chinese and Iranians to make sure that there is no Western forces in Afghanistan. And also they wanted a complete monopoly over Afghanistan affair that was taken away from them by Western countries being involved directly with Afghanistan.
Which in turn is what they've got, which in turn is what they've ended up with. Right. They've got what they wanted. But I don't think this is going to do any good for them, and it's not certainly for Afghanistan or for the Taliban's rule, because they are just pillaging Afghanistan for all its resources. They're taking the Taliban for everything they've got, and the Afghan people are a byproduct of the suffering which the Taliban is inflicting on them. Is doubly being inflicted by the Taliban becoming this pariah entity that doesn't really, this isn't the Taliban we saw 20 years ago. That we don't see the same external, let's say, media coverage of the Taliban. They don't have the same sensationalist rhetoric that we saw 20 years ago. The sort of, let's go with the sort of IS-esque narrative of the Taliban, that they aren't that anymore. And I think that's largely down to the fact that they are so reliant on these neighboring countries for backing and for support, that they've got this relationship with these countries that is essentially an abusive relationship. And I don't think, when I say that, I mean that they're getting their dues. I think they're getting what they richly deserve. But the Afghan people who are on the sort of bottom level of this, who are beneath all this, continue to suffer, while countries around Afghanistan continue to take Afghanistan for everything it has. And Afghanistan's people don't actually get anything. So it's a real catch-22 situation, I think, for the West, is how do you help Afghan people without aiding and abetting the Taliban and aiding and abetting those allies, which again are that third layer of pillage and taking from Afghanistan itself.
Yes, and to your point, to expand it a little bit, Taliban as a terrorist organization, and since the turn, we have seen also all of the terrorist organizations coming back to Afghanistan, whether that's Al-Qaeda, whether that's ISIS-K, and all other terrorist groups, regional groups. And also since the recapturing of Afghanistan, we see a spike in the number of incidents across Western countries. Do you see that connection there, that since the return of the Taliban, attacks in the Western countries have increased, that, the terrorism is probably one of the tools that the axis of evil is using to undermine the Western countries? When the Taliban coming back and having a state, a geography under their control is basically a threat that is built up against the Western countries, because they do not want to engage the West directly. Like, they do not have the forces, they do not have the institutional capability to face to engage in a direct confrontation with the West. So I think what they're trying to do is resort and use terrorism as a proxy element, or as a asymmetric warfare style to go after the West. Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's totally what's happening. I think that assessment is spot on. I think that the problem is the Taliban and the regional actors in that region, like you say, ISK and other Haqqani networks, if you like, are unable to have any leverage over the West. So what they have to do is undermine democracy by infiltrating these countries. We've just seen attacks in London targeting a prominent human rights activist by Taliban proxies, and we see talks popping up of Islamist clerics and those who are spouting the hate, if you like, in the West, and trying to do this more and more. And like you say, attacks are rising. We've seen attacks recently in Germany, which we don't yet know whether those are directly related to Islamist terror, but Islamist terror is on the rise, and I think it's down to the fact that they're totally against Western democracy, Western values, Western cultures, Western beliefs. And so the only way to have leverage and be able to shout what they want to shout is to attack directly in countries via small scale lone wolf attacks, or because I think the West has since 9/11 has cracked down so heavily on large scale terror attacks and the ability of them to be carried out. Yes, we see them, but I think we see a lot more lone wolf attacks as a direct result of people radicalized, if you like, by that sort of by that region of Sharia Islam or Sharia law proliferation.
Yeah, and the issue is that since the Taliban came about, even prior to the collapse, we saw the rise of ISIS-K in Afghanistan, which was never before present in Afghanistan. And then all of a sudden, with ISIS-K committing all sorts of violence, like barbaric attacks, much worse than the Taliban, similar in part, but much worse and barbaric, going after children in a hospital, unborn children, pregnant women, and all that. And then the atrocities of ISIS-K, it seems, was used as a way to paint the Taliban as a lesser evil. So as a result, that paved the way for the engagement by the neighboring countries, that paved the way for Western countries. And so the Taliban have realized, because ISIS-K is basically an offshoot of the Taliban, right? These former Taliban commanders who became ISIS-K. And they believe in the same thing. They believe in the same caliphate. They believe in the elimination of the Western values, Western influence, and basically everything that liberal states stand for and liberal human beings stand for. They want to eliminate that. And Taliban are believing the same way, but they're portraying themselves as geographically contained, versus ISIS-K that does not portray themselves as such. And so with more of an attack or threats that was created by ISIS-K, the more the Taliban were seen as probably a partner in counterterrorism. Yeah. So they gain leverage, and they saw that benefit of playing good cop, bad cop. So since that comes out, you see more of these attacks, these lone wolf attacks that you're indicating. All of these are Afghan nationals. Coincidentally, all of these are Afghan, whether it's in the US, whether it is in Germany, in Europe, in UK, in Australia. Some Afghan starts doing something. Like, we know as Afghans that it would not be possible without somebody directing them to do this. It's not that somebody all of a sudden realized that work up after 30 years of, or 20 years or 5 years or 2 years living here that they want to do something. These were the people who were directed or either recruited prior to coming to these countries, or after the Taliban took over, they have access to the database of all of the Afghans living anywhere, right? They have the access of their family ties, they travel back and forth and all that. They are able to then tap into those vulnerabilities and weaknesses and on the linkages of the families to force and coerce these Afghans to attack. And so when they're doing this, countries freak out that there was a terrorist attack. So who's going to be partner? These are Afghans. Let's go talk to the Taliban. The same way that Germans are doing. Like, unfortunately, there are criminal attacks or criminality in Germany. Let's talk to the Taliban to deport these Afghans, which is a very wrong way of.
I think. Yeah, well, it's funny, isn't it? Because that's sort of a pseudo narrative of send them back to me, so I can further sort of radicalize them under my hand. And I think this is, we must say that this is a very, very, very tiny minority rather of Afghans that have committed I think the last 2 or 3 attacks across the West, from Novemberish last year across Germany, Netherlands, those countries. And I think this is a tiny minority, but I think it just shows, as you say, just to go back to the point of when the Taliban were not in control, and we had these other, like say ISK was quite prominent at one time as being a key proxy actor of Islamic terror. And I think that what we saw with them was that everyone was looking over here when really we should have been looking over here, and that allowed the Taliban to basically recalibrate and rebuild and reformalize. So when Afghanistan succumbed to the Taliban again in August and September of 2021, they were able to do that because everybody was looking elsewhere. And everybody, because nobody saw it coming, and I think that as you say, this lone wolf attacks that we're seeing now, thankfully not often, and thankfully not happening very, I've just said it's not happening a lot. It is again another sort of what do you do with these people? Because it's a case of Western democratic values, rule of law, protection of human rights, totally juxtaposing this, deport them back to Afghanistan, which sort of seems very counter what the West is there for. We've been seen as the safe haven for refugees, and now that seemingly on the small scale coming back to bite to the West. But it's also, what do you do with these people then? There's so much talk now, obviously here in the UK, about deporting foreign nationals, but when it comes to countries such as Afghanistan, where you're deporting people back to the hands of a terror organization, it's either further radicalization or you're deporting them to persecution. So it leaves us really quite horrid dilemma of how Western countries can now negate this issue.
Yeah. I think that they need to do a total reevaluation of what they're actually doing. They're doing it like tactically here and there, steps that unintentionally probably they're serving the agenda of the Taliban. Any country, if you look at it, from the time that they have accepted some Taliban representative or some Taliban delegation that have visited their countries, except the Arab countries who are basically controlling everything that Taliban are doing in those countries. But as soon as they arrive in states where they have some freedom of movement, they get connected with the mafia groups in those countries. Yeah. They get into cartels and drug traffickers with criminals. And as a result, they build influence to further destabilize the countries that they just reached. And by destabilizing them, they gain leverage because they're we may be a partner in trying to help you out in the situation, while they are the culprits. If you look at it, it's all Taliban, because every terrorist in the world, they are pledging allegiance to the Taliban leader as their emir. Like even the Al-Qaeda leader is pledging allegiance.
It's exactly true. When you see these attacks happen, and when the aftermath happens and they're arrested and etc., it comes out that they're acting on behalf of the Taliban or proxies, and I think It's funny because I think we're reliving what we lived 20 years ago, and you see this so much from intelligence forces, that intelligence agencies of countries that are saying this, that we're going to relive this because of open borders, because of the situation that we've in essence created. But it's such a, I think it's a, we've seen recently in the UK, I can't think of the names, but there's 4 clerics, Islamic clerics, that are coming to the UK to do a talk, and the UK government's been urged to stop them from entering the country, because again, they will come here, they will radicalize, they will get people to carry out lone wolf attacks, etc., and equally, they are essentially spouting hate speech. That's exactly what they're coming here to do, and they're coming here to radicalize. These missions of Islamics, those that have been radicalized in Afghanistan coming to the West, is exactly to do that, is to further radicalize. And I think we have to have this zero tolerance approach to that. We've imported the problem to so many countries that we now need to get rid of it. And if we continue to go down this route of sort of don't offend, don't do this, don't do that, we're going to create this really sticky issue. So yeah, that's essentially what. Sorry, dog barking in the background.
That's fine. That's fine. He was to take part. Clearly, we are observing the situation in United Kingdom. From time to time there are protests, there are eruptions, insecurity, damaging property, public property. It's like chaos from time to time, and you see videos from different parts of the United Kingdom. So what do you think is the general mood? Are these enough? Are the people are saying this is enough? Let's take decisive action and get rid of anybody who is a sympathizer of the Taliban terrorists, and get rid of them, put them somewhere like President Trump is trying to do here in Guantanamo or somewhere. That you can keep an eye on them, because these are basically criminals, right? They shouldn't be free.
Yeah.
They should be either eliminated or they should be imprisoned. That's why we have justice system, right? For as a human beings, so we need to be strict on implementing that justice system.
No, I agree, and I think there is a move towards that. I think it's funny in the US how you've got Donald Trump now, who's sitting in the Oval Office, who's got the zero tolerance approach to all of this, and I think that there is a uncomfortableness, I think, with the West over how to now renegate this issue. I think, and I totally agree that is the solution. It is deport those who do not agree with Western values. Specifically, if you want to come here, then you've got to fit in, and we're seeing so much of that not happening. And I think that's a major issue, and I think it's a really tricky issue to negate. But that there is so much we're seeing happening in the media, and I think here in the UK there is an appetite for this to happen. But again, we have so many safeguards, such as the European Convention of Human Rights, which stop people from being removed if they have family ties, if there's different issues really. But I don't quite know where we go forward with this, or how we continue to negate this. I think it is going to be sort of like a whole-scale deportation that is going to have to happen. And I hate to say that, and I know that many people that maybe will watch this will maybe disagree with me, but how else do you deal with this issue? And I don't know quite what the answer will be.
Yeah, equally in deporting them, but I don't want the Western countries to feel obligated that in order to implement this deportation, that they need to speak with an illegitimate government in Afghanistan.
Yeah, no, I agree.
A terrorist organization, because then you're legitimizing them, right? Empowering them, and by speaking with them and empowering them, they gain further leverage to be able to further infiltrate your society, with the newly found leverage, with the newly found legitimacy, as you're speaking with them, as you're talking with them, as you gave them FaceTime, they are able to then force your own citizens, dual citizens, and others to work for them, because they're like, now we're coming, we're going to be there in a few months. We have taken embassies, now we have closed the embassies. Next time our diplomats will be there. Then what are you going to do? You need passports, you need tazkaras, you need to go back to Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, this is a major issue, isn't it? The whole diplomatic side of things. You've got so many Afghanistan missions, such as the one in Geneva, who I've worked quite closely with, who they have no internal leverage. They have ability to do a lot of the things they can do. They can't issue passports. They can't issue, and the Taliban, obviously, in their decrees, I think it was in November, wasn't it? They removed all of these abilities of embassies to act, because they wouldn't accept their ambassadors. They wouldn't accept the Taliban's ideology, their policies, their governance. And I think that then has left lots of Afghans in the West in a very tricky position. But I think that my hard line with this is that we cannot, no matter what, you cannot capitulate, and you cannot recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government. It would be absolutely hypocritical, and it would be a slap in the face to the Afghan people, both in the West and also those that have been left behind and those that continue to suffer in Afghanistan. But we need to get a grip on what we can get a grip on, and that is the sort of transnational repression which we're seeing, those that are being targeted across the West, those that are coming to the West to spread hate. We can crack down on that, and I think that, as I said earlier in the conversation, that what we need to continue to focus on is delegitimization of the Taliban, is shutting down their avenues to access things, is shutting down their allies' access to access things, because ultimately that is the only way that you defeat this ideology. Yes. There's no other way to do it, and I think that we're getting to a point now where you have countless conversations. I'm sure you do, and I do the same, about how we negate this future of Afghanistan. Well, the simple answer is that you cannot go on as we are. We have to see the fall of the Taliban in order to go back in and try and do something for the Afghan people. But like you say, that includes cracking down on cells that are opening in the West, of hotspots of terrorist ideology, of hotspots of this of this Islamic cult, if you like. And I think one thing to mention on the back of all this is that we have to remember that actually when you strip all of this, all of the fact that Islam has been propagated as a terror religion, is that you strip all of this back and it isn't, but we've allowed this to continue to proliferate. We've allowed so this Islamic fundamentalism to continue to rise and to spread and to get to this position, but actually none of this, all of this is very new in recent history, and so we need to get to a point where states, governments recognize again that there is many Afghans and many in the Middle East that want to come and get on with their lives and live peacefully and integrate, and that is where we need to get back to, because we've got this now zero tolerance, I think, in many Western countries approach, or we're getting towards that, where we're constantly seeing these attacks on our screens. We're constantly seeing, the fact that mullahs are coming to the West and spreading hate, and we need to get back to the fact that actually, if we can consolidate this, and if we can get this back to something that's controllable, which was something that I first talked about, that the whole takeover of Afghanistan allowed this to proliferate. And if we can get it back to something which is controllable and something that can be siloed and put away, then we can all be safer and better off, and back to the welcoming societies that we are.
Yeah, I think that the way to do that is to find a sustainable, lasting solution, is basically to provide the necessary space, at least in the Western societies and Western countries, where that space is not there in the region, because all of them are authoritarian, all of them are in cahoots with the Taliban, to for anti-Taliban Afghans to rise up, for the Afghan Taliban and Taliban Afghans to coordinate, to work with each other, especially women groups and others, to basically form a government in exile, hopefully, and then that would be a counterpart for the Western countries to engage on Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think a government in exile is exactly where it needs to be to start with, but I think it's not a sustainable solution in the long term, because it's a bit like the fact of having diaspora communities to advocate in parliaments and diaspora communities to advocate, and those that there's valiant politicians from the Ghani administration who are advocating for Afghanistan's revival and post-Taliban what Afghanistan will look like. But again, we're no closer to getting to that position. So whilst people advocating in the West and coming to parliaments and coming to creating spaces and creating space for women and girls is incredible and must be harnessed, and I do so much of that myself. And we must give a voice to the voiceless. We also must acknowledge that at some stage, we have to have a governance structure for Afghanistan, which can be implemented at a time when the Taliban can cease to exist again. And we will constantly have this rise and fall of the Taliban or of proxy forces, proxy terror organizations rather. We need to start to create that political solution. And I think we do too much talking about the sensationalist aspect of terrorism, Islamic terrorism, but we don't do so much of harnessing the Afghan people and their ability to create change and to create the structures in the West to be able to go back and imagine a future for Afghanistan. It's something that I've worked on, something that I am working on under the Duty Legacy, is to bring together NGOs and women's rights groups. And I had meetings with the Tony Blair Institute in London some months back about how we create a future for Afghanistan and a future a political system which recognizes all groups and their stake in a future. And until we do that, we're not going to have a future. And I think that's one of the core issues. Afghanistan is such a divided ethnography, and it's such a divided landscape of groups where nobody really talks, and there are such tribal identities. We need to get to a place where those tribal identities talk to each other, and we get to a level playing field, because Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, many different groups. There's too much diversion, and there's too equally when you have conversations in the West, there's too much infighting, there's too much disagreement over what the future of Afghanistan should look like, and that can't be Western led. We've seen what that looks like. It needs to be Afghan people led.
Yes, and we are working on that, ferociously. And as you indicated, of course, any debate is very normal in any society, in a democratic society where there is a space for people to disagree and debate issues. You can't do that under the Taliban regime or authoritarian rules, but you do it under a democratic umbrella. Yeah. And fortunately, now the line is becoming much more of a Taliban, pro-Taliban versus anti-Taliban Afghans. Yeah. So no matter which ethnicity or gender, it is either you're anti-Taliban or you're Taliban or pro-Taliban. And so that's the line that we're working on. And one line of effort I think that could be useful is to stop this trend of closure of Afghan embassies in the Western societies, because we saw that in the region that authoritarian states were the first to give the embassies to the Taliban. Reciprocal diplomatic exchange. But for the Western countries, I mean, these embassies are basically a space for Afghans to come together for solidarity, support each other. And if the Taliban issued a statement saying that they don't recognize these embassies, I mean, that doesn't take away their legitimacy as long as the host continue to engage. And if they do so, I mean, it could be helpful for themselves as well, because imagine somebody being directed by the Taliban under the direction of a Chinese officer to destabilize UK or Europe or elsewhere. And this is an Afghan national, imagine. And so the Afghan embassies, if they are managed by anti-Taliban Afghans, they could serve as a partner with the host countries to identify these individuals in the community who are becoming radicalized, who are having more frequent visits to Afghanistan, or that are suspicion under the Taliban, or they have contacts with the Taliban members. And overall, they could be a partner for safety and security of countries in
Yeah.
the West. So it's unfortunate to see that they're closing these embassies at a time when they need to be open. They need to be given to Afghans who are can be counterterrorism partners of the West, right?
I think a large amount of this is education. It's education for the West. It's education for societies that actually about what diplomats do and about what diplomatic missions do. They support nationals in the country where they are. And embassies do so much. We saw last year with the closure of the UK, with the Afghanistan embassy UK, and we've seen it so much with the pressure that's been placed on Afghanistan's diplomatic missions, with the withdrawal of funds, with the withdrawal of ability to give out passports and to give out consular access, and it's a real pity. And I think quite a few missions have seen that in country that governments have tried to prop up embassies and give them the ability to continue to function because they aren't obviously getting funding from host nations. And that's something that we must continue to do, to keep those diplomatic ties, those diplomatic doors open for Afghans in Western countries to be able to continue to have dialogue and to continue to seek support, because ultimately, if they all close, then there is nothing stopping, if you like, Afghans from thinking they have to go back home, because there's nothing for them to be able to support them. There's nothing, they're essentially alone. So it's again, we've created this situation that is so helpless. And I'll go back to what I first said, which was that Western nations don't want to engage with the issues that have been created since coalition forces failed in Afghanistan, and we still don't want to open our eyes to it. We still don't want to deal with these issues. And again, the closure of diplomatic missions is such a shame. But again, it's another byproduct of our failure, of Western failure in Afghanistan. But I think if you look at history, this is how Afghanistan has been. This is how Afghanistan works. It is a mineral-rich country. It's an oil-rich country. It's a country that is constantly pulled at from all angles. It's a country which has been exploited by forces throughout history, and this is just the latest, if you like, reimagining of that. And as pitiful and horrifying as it is to see, I do, to end on a positive note, I have faith that within our lifetime we will one day be able to set foot in a democratic, prosperous Afghanistan that serves the Afghan people, and is once again thriving. But for now, I think it's for the West to continue to support Afghans who are in the West, and so many that I meet, wherever it may be, Germany, the UK, US, or wherever it may be. Afghans are hardworking. Afghans want to be a part of the society which they're in. Afghans are have the ethos of sort of family and culture at the heart of them. And I think that we must do so much to continue to support Afghans, because eventually the time will come when Afghanistan is free and when Afghanistan can re-democratize. But for now, we have to sit tight. And whilst we talk about Islamic extremism, whilst we talk about the spread of hate, and whilst we talk about undermining of Western values, there will come a time where we have to re-engage.
Yes, hopefully soon. The people of Afghanistan are, as you stated, are hardworking, and when they put their minds into something, they will get it done. And right now, it seems that every Afghan that you speak to is an anti-Taliban Afghan, not a Taliban sympathizer. Is they're aiming at freedom of Afghanistan and freedom of more than 20 million women and girls who are imprisoned there. And the mechanism that we're thinking about, since we know that the Western countries have other priorities, is people's uprising, is to basically launch a people's uprising throughout the country, so that we can topple the Taliban within the country. And then at that moment, of course, we expect our international allies, particularly in the West, to support the people of Afghanistan, to then come out with a statement of support if the Taliban try to resort to violence or to try to crush the people's uprising. We want Western countries to support us. So in that note, which is positive and hopeful, if you could tell me about the recent efforts at the international court level, these possibly arresting of the Taliban leaders and other Taliban members to be prosecuted, to be arrested, and hopefully they be imprisoned. And also the change of administration in the U.S., where it seems an anti-Taliban cabinet is formed in the U.S. Do you see these things moving at the international level in a positive direction towards the fall of the Taliban?
I think everything is moving in a positive direction to the fall of the Taliban, really. I think, if we go through the international legal accountability mechanisms which are currently in place, I'll talk about three, really, which is obviously the ICC have put out arrest warrants for the Taliban leadership. Now, the ICC as a mechanism has many of its own faults, but one of the best things about the ICC is its ability for member states who are signatories of the Rome Statute to obviously arrest those who arrive on their territory. And I think this is going to significantly shut down and if they don't arrest, then they will suffer sanctions from the ICC. So I think this is going to significantly shut down the network of the Taliban and their ability to travel and their ability to go where they want to. And obviously the other and obviously we've been waiting for these arrest warrants for so long, so it's great to see these first ones come out. Hopefully there will be more, but it's great to see some form of symbolic justice taking place at the ICJ level. Gender apartheid cases, again, another really great mechanism. Obviously that the ICJ is a state level mechanism rather than individuals. Obviously ICC is criminal accountability, ICC is criminal accountability, ICJ is more symbolic accountability via sanctions, etc. But I think another great case that will again just be another signifier, symbol of Afghanistan's resistance and the ability for people to give testimony, etc., will be really, really welcome. I think the third level is this sort of human-centered level of justice, which we're seeing a lot of transitional justice pathways open for Afghanistan, and we've seen that with the UN Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett announcing sort of this people-centered mechanism, this ability for truth, justice, and reconciliation to take place amongst communities and people to really to feed into this, and I think this is where we're going to see, like we talked about, the agency of Afghans in the West to be able to take power into their own hands. That's where they're going to be really able to contribute to this. I think that the Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett has done an incredible job. I've met him a few times, and he really has done an incredible job alongside Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in gathering evidence, in holding perpetrators to account, if you like, via advocacy efforts. And I think these advocacy efforts are so welcome. They're a long time coming. They're really welcome. But I think again, it's for now symbolic justice, and I think we need to keep that at hand, which is that all these efforts will come together and all these efforts will deliver something. It's sort of when, not if, but it's all very welcome, to see it happening.
Absolutely. And we as Afghans, we are very hopeful that hopefully this time they will their approach will be different. So if there is an arrest warrant issued for Taliban leaders, or there's bounty on the Taliban leaders, and if they're not traveling to UK or they're not traveling to US for the relevant institutions to arrest them, the law enforcement entities in these countries with counterterrorism entities, they could form task forces, joint task forces, and maybe they could go in Afghanistan and get these guys. Treat the world as our own backyard, as our own home, which is shared, and having these criminals, these thugs, these terrorists roaming freely and waiting for them to come to us, it's better for us to go in. So instead of, as an alternative to sending armed forces to Afghanistan, Afghanistan. I would suggest that maybe the law enforcement entities in the US, like FBI and UK and other countries that are mostly focused internally, that they should maybe, it's time for them to look externally.
I mean, the National Crime Agency would be the agency that would undertake these arrest warrants here. But I think that I think pitifully we're a long way off anybody going to Afghanistan to arrest people themselves. And I think it goes back to the fact that we are very, very scared in the West of failure again on Afghanistan. I think so. But I think the symbolic justice of this, the fact that actually the Taliban are pretty powerless actually outside of their little sphere of influence, and I think that that actually they don't want to take the risk of engaging with any of these mechanisms or coming to the West, or these proxies that we see popping up. We talk about the hate preachers and people who are coming to spread this hatred, this fundamentalism, and I think that's as much as it is, that's as weak as it is, and that's what all we're going to get. I don't think we're going to see the Taliban leaders popping up anywhere in the West anytime soon, because they are scared of what will happen should they do that. But again, in the background, all these mechanisms, ICC, ICJ, UN mechanisms are all ticking around in the background, and I think there will be a level of I don't want to engage or don't want to go there, because if I do, there will be a chance that I could be arrested, and then in sort of as a symbolic aspect, that won't look very good for the Taliban.
Yeah. Hopefully it will coincide with the people of Afghanistan rising up against the Taliban, toppling them, and simultaneously there could be a joint mechanism where we can arrest them, bring them to Western societies, and put them in front of women prosecutors and women judges for them to be imprisoned for life, so that there could be a less.
We see this through universal jurisdiction, but again, the fact of the matter is that we haven't got a legitimate government, and recognition is an important part of all this. And so it's such a hard, we're in such a dilemma of opposites of how to negate this.
Yeah, fascinating conversation, James. I really enjoy talking with you. There's a lot that I can discuss with you, but the time is running up. So we'll have you again in future discussions, of course, to discuss in details various aspects and other issues that left from today's conversation. But maybe at the end, you could tell us your advice. What do you advise the governments of the West, particularly United Kingdom's government, on how to better support the people of Afghanistan in our collective desire to topple the Taliban regime through a people's uprising, and also bring back our democracy, bring back our people's government that could be a counterterrorism partner for all of the Western countries, and that could facilitate the presence of diplomatic forces and other forces in the region, so that we can collaborate on joint issues in the region and globally.
Well, I think to start with, we must continue to harness the resilience of the Afghan people, and this cannot be underestimated. I think that the Afghan diaspora communities have done so much. I've led the all-party parliamentary group on Hazaras and the advocacy for that in the UK Parliament. Also been involved with efforts in the US and efforts across Europe, and I think that the diaspora community's ability to advocate for themselves is quite exemplary, and I think that we will not see that wane. I don't think we will ever see that wane. We're 4 years on from the Taliban takeover, and it's still not waning today, and I don't think we will see that. The Afghan people won't be silenced, and I think that's really good, and they will continue to hold governments to account on any actions that they take regarding the Taliban and their legitimization, if you like, and any trade deals, etc. I think that the Afghan people must just continue to do what they do in a similar vein to what they have been doing, continue to advocate, continue to reach out, continue to form coalitions, continue to lobby governments, continue to lobby elected officials, continue to push the causes of women and girls, of minorities, continue to push the the fact that actually we want a strong, stable Afghanistan, and people want to return to Afghanistan. That's the thing that we miss. That's the thing that we are missing in this matrix, is that Afghan people do not want to be in the West forever. They want to be able to return to their homelands. They want to be able to return to their villages. And actually, without Western support, we can't get there. But actually, there are many efforts, as the efforts we've talked about in this talk just now, that are ongoing to get there. And we must continue to support those and support the Afghan people to take that power into their own hands.
Thank you very much, James Joseph, Director of Duty Legacy. It was a pleasure to have you in our program. This was our today's show, the episode on Real Talks with Amini, where we discussed various aspects of the challenges in Afghanistan and Afghanistan's relationship with the West, and also possible path for the future of freedom in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan that is friends with the West, and a partner on counterterrorism and other issues of mutual interest for both of our countries. So with that hope, thank you very much. Until the next show, God bless you. God bless Afghanistan. God bless our world. Thank you.